what I want to point out here is that 80% of the thing that holds people back in the humanities, generally, doing humanities-based analysis, generally, isn't skill. I'll teach you the skill, and I'm already teaching you the skill. I mean, mastering the skill is just taking these two things I've kind of put down, adding a third thing, and mastering it. It's just practice. You've already kind of been given 2/3 of what you have to learn in this class. Now it's just a matter of getting them working a bit further, right? If the problem is that's 80% of it isn't that. 80% of it is actually getting over sort of confidence issues, generally on the part of people who don't want to say anything because they don't want to sound like they don't know what they're talking about. That's a sort of interesting point. Like, consider the conundrum. Humanities are supposed to be teaching you something. They're a method for teaching you stuff. In fact, I've already talked about this. It's not so much the end result of a process. Humanities is itself a kind of process to learn how things work, to build up intuition, to build up critical thinking, etc., etc. But it's also a process by which one learns things that are honestly encyclopedic. So consider, for instance, I'm pretty good at this. What do I know about ancient Greece? I know a lot about ancient Greece. I know quite a lot about ancient Greece. Okay, well, how did I learn so much about ancient Greece? Well, I read the Iliad, I read the Odyssey, I've read a bunch of plays, I've read a bunch of philosophers, I've read some historians, I've read some Greek historians, I've looked at Greek art, I've listened, I study the Greek myths, I've read different versions of them. So that's how I know. All of those things are humanities, right? And so are those the things I use the humanities to learn this other thing, which we'll call, things to know about ancient Greece? I got it from studying the humanities. And so these things are like building blocks. Now, if somebody had said at the very beginning, listen, you can't read the Iliad because you don't know anything about ancient Greece, well, that's backwards. I learn about ancient Greece by reading the Iliad, right? It's not the other way around. But for most people, that backwardsness, that fear, it sort of paralyzes them. They say, I don't know enough about the subject to tell you anything. But you ask me to look at a Rembrandt painting and to make descriptive elements within it, and make descriptive statements about it, and then evaluate those descriptive statements. Well, how can I evaluate anything? I don't know anything about Rembrandt. And you say, well, that's the thing, though. By doing this, you will learn things about Rembrandt. But they say, yeah, but I don't know enough about Rembrandt to even start the process. You don't have to know anything about Rembrandt to start the process. That is a misnomer. That is a fallacy. The things you are learning through this process. Starting the process from knowing nothing, and you don't know nothing. You know things, right? You know what love is. You know what hate is. You know what fear and desire and all these human elements, you know what they are, I assume. Unless you're kind of a robot or you've got some sort of thing going on there, in which case I'm sorry. I didn't mean to insult you. But most of us know this stuff. We don't start from ground, from base. We've got some things on our side. And then we learn about this stuff through the humanities. But I want to point those out. Like, so if I say, like, what do you think the author's point in this poem was? And you hear people say, well, I don't know anything about the author. How do I know what their point was? Well, you're reading their poem. The poem is an example of the kind of point that this person would make. And say, well, okay, well, what do you think the average reader takes away, or viewer, or experiencer of the art from this poster? This is destroy this brute, this World War I propaganda poster. What do you think the average viewer takes away from that? Well, I don't know. Well, yes, you do. You're the average viewer. This poster is totally designed to appeal to you in some way, in a very specific way. So how did it appeal to you? Because that will be an example of it. You're already sitting there. And this is, honestly, this is one of those things that frustrates me about this kind of process. No one is going to round you up and take your money away if you don't understand a poem, right? If you get some of this stuff wrong, well, then I correct your course. It's very hard to get this wrong, right? I'm asking you, hey, notice something and tell me what you think it implies. That's very, very opinion-based. It's supportable, but nonetheless, it's very opinion-based. So getting it wrong is almost impossible. Not completely impossible, but almost impossible. If I say, hey, okay, well, based off of, let me give you a good example of this. If I say like, okay, if I gave you a poem and from the 13th century, and I said, what does this poem tell us about the people at that time and their opinion about the divine right of kings? And you go, I can't tell you because I wasn't around in the 13th century, so I have no idea. No, but the poem was, right? And so you use the poem as evidence. Maybe you have to look up divine right of kings. Okay, that's fine. But you might actually not have to. You might just look in the poem and say, okay, well, what does it say about kings? Well, this is what it says about kings. Does that comment on the divine right of kings? Chances are it probably does. But if you can't get that, then maybe you just Google, divine right of kings, and you would get at least a base knowledge and look for those things in the poem. And then by using the poem, it would build upon your base knowledge that you gained from Google. And I'm not kidding. It's 80% of success in artistic interpretation. Art meaning things that are created by people and interpreted by people, get a meaning by people. 80% of success is just acknowledging that you don't need to know something to get to the poem, or you don't need to know something to get to the painting, that the painting gives you something, and you're figuring out how to get it out of the painting. Okay? Now, that being said, I think there are three major contexts in which meaning can be derived. And I want to also say something in terms of what I say by meaning. If that is a complicated term for you, it shouldn't be. Really all I'm asking for is the moral of the story, right? The message behind the story. What is the moral? What is the message? Message is often given to sort of religious stuff, and moral comes more for fairy tales. But it doesn't really matter. Both of them mean about the same thing, and they can be applied to almost all art. When you're doing this process of finding evaluative statements and descriptive statements, what you're eventually looking for is a message, a meaning, a moral, okay? I'm calling all of those contextualized statements. Notice I didn't say the message, the meaning, the moral. Let's face it, Hansel and Gretel has one moral for Hansel and Gretel, and another moral for the witch. And by the way, another moral for the parents who leave the kids on the side of the road because they don't have enough money to feed the kids. life was hard, man, in the Black Forest of Germany. Like, look, see, I learned something about the Black Forest of Germany just by reading Hansel and Gretel. Do I know anything about the Black Forest in Germany? No. But I know that during the medieval period in the Black Forest in Germany, it was okay if you don't have enough money to leave your kids by the side of the road. How do I know that? Because the parents aren't villains. I know nothing about the Black Forest in Germany. I know really, honestly, nothing. There's a ride at where's that amusement park over by Colonial Williamsburg. There's a ride that goes to the Black Forest of Germany. That's all I know. That, and I know this thing about Hansel and Gretel. There you go. Any case. Off of Hansel and Gretel. Message, meaning, moral, right? They all come down to contextualized statements. You're looking for a moral, a meaning. And here's what some of those look like. Often you put them in context of one of three areas. Now, this isn't exhaustive. There might be other ways of doing this, but I'm giving you the basics. I don't know. Maybe you need pen and paper. Hopefully I'm turning this into a PowerPoint presentation. If that's happened, then thumbs up to me. In any case, authorial intent. Okay, what was the author trying to imply? Often, these statements start with like the author was implying blank, or the author was showing that blank, or the work illustrates the author's belief that blank, right? That's looking at the authorial meaning inside of a work. For a lot of you put way too much stress on the author. If I could give you a poem and you say, well, what was the author intending? Who cares what the author was intending? What did you get out of it, right? Sometimes the author is a pain, right? I don't know, you ever listen to Taylor Swift songs? Every one of them, she is in some different kind of romantic tryst. It's hard to understand what dating Taylor Swift must actually be like, given that in one song she's some sort of dream girl, in another song she's the girl next door, in another song she's a psycho. And so you go, well, the author can lie. I don't know if you know that. The second thing is the reader response. So in this kind of way of looking at context, you're actually analyzing it according to what the reader gets out of it. And that means like the average reader, most readers, pretty much any reader who's paying attention, including yourself, one would hope. But for the most part, it's not exhaustive, You want to work with general readers. It's a little harder if you're like, well, I hate Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley because I was dating a guy named Percy Bysshe Shelley and he was a horrible guy and I just hated him. And so I hate anything by the poet, even though they're not the same guy. I hate everything by... No. We're going to average reader, not just you. Average reader, what did they get out of it? Although sometimes you will read interesting essays that are sort of personal essays, that involve one's experience with art, but often they universalize it by the end to suggest what most readers get out of art, or what I say readers, but viewers, listeners, experiencers of the art. Statements for these kind of things are things like the work's overall effect on the reader is. The work attempts to challenge the reader's beliefs by. The work could be read with an emphasis on theme X, ultimately lending it an ironic tone, something like that. And then finally, one of the ways we look at art is to say, what does it teach us about the culture in which it was created? And this can be complicated because sometimes the art is reacting against the culture, and sometimes it has elements in it that are part of the culture. Take, for instance, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which I'm not sure, they don't teach that in high school. I'm not really sure how many people have heard of Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice is an interesting play in which one of the main characters is a Jew named Shylock. And for 90% of the play, it's ridiculously anti-Semitic. Like, it's not like they're against Shylock. They go out and they're like Nazis or anything, but they don't like Shylock. All the main characters, they just don't like Shylock. They talk bad about him. And the only reason they can kind of give for not liking Shylock is that he's Jewish. And one would assume that this is sort of like a commentary on, essential characteristics of Elizabethan culture, that just anti-Semitism was prevalent during that time, and Shakespeare just followed suit, and as a result, his play is anti-Semitic. But there's this moment in the play where Shylock gives his speech about his humanity. Don't, if I prick me, do I not bleed? He's basically saying, why are you so mean to me? Don't you understand? I'm a human being just like you. And it's very powerful, to the point where you might say, listen, if Shakespeare's goal was to be anti-Semitic, then he wouldn't have included that part of the play. And doing contextual criticism on this in terms of like a culture, trying to learn about Elizabethan culture, the play has parts that totally conform to Elizabethan views on Jews. Elizabethan means like around 1600. 1600 is when Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. 1601, I think. I may be wrong, 1604. I'm always off a little bit. I'm sorry about that. I don't have this stuff memorized. It's not Googling in front of me. But nonetheless, I think Hamlet's around 1604. That was a real turn in Shakespeare's career in terms of the kinds of plays he wrote. But Elizabethan, that's Queen Elizabeth was queen during that time. That's why it's the Elizabethan era. Learn new things every day. There are parts of the play that conform to Elizabethan culture, and there are parts that critique it, is I guess my point. But you can use art to learn about a culture. In fact, sometimes art is the only thing you have to learn about a culture. How do we know what the ancient Egyptians are like? Well, we look at their buildings. That's architecture. That's an art. How do we know what ancient Sumeria was like? Well, not much. We have Gilgamesh. That's a poem. So we derive, what do we know about Vikings? They didn't write a lot down, believe it or not. Vikings were not a very prolific group of writers. We have their legends, often which were passed down orally. That's what we have. So there are ways in which we can put art in the context of what it teaches us about its culture. And this too has sort of a kind of effect for us. Ultimately, we're these descriptive statements that lead up to these evaluative statements. We collect the evaluative statements and hope that they congeal into, say, one contextual statement that generally falls into one of these three categories. Either it's a commentary on the author, it's a commentary on the reader and their experience, or it's a commentary on the culture in which the art was created. Okay.